Kate Williams had always believed that love could conquer anything. Standing in the grand hallway of Buckingham Palace, her hands trembling as she clutched the official letter, she realized how naive that belief had been. The cream-colored paper felt heavy in her fingers, each word written there like a dagger to her heart. The scandal had erupted 3 weeks ago when photographs surfaced of her having lunch with James Mitchell, a childhood friend who had recently divorced. The images, taken by persistent photographers, showed nothing more than two old friends sharing a meal and catching up on lost time. But the tabloids had painted a different picture entirely. Headlines screamed of affairs and betrayal, of a future queen caught in a web of lies. Kate had tried to explain to William that James was nothing more than a friend, someone she had known since school days when they were both awkward teenagers trying to figure out their place in the world. James had reached out during his difficult divorce, seeking comfort from an old friend who understood the pressures of living under public scrutiny. Their lunch had been innocent, filled with conversations about their children, memories of simpler times, and James seeking advice about co-parenting after his marriage ended. But the media machine had already begun its relentless assault. Every angle was analyzed, every gesture scrutinized. Body language experts appeared on morning shows, declaring that Kate's posture suggested romantic interest. Fashion critics dissected her outfit choice, claiming it was too casual for a married woman meeting another man. Social media buzzed with cruel comments and wild speculation that spread like wildfire across the internet. The pressure had been mounting for days. Royal advisors whispered in corridors about damage control and public perception. Focus groups showed declining approval ratings. The ancient institution of the monarchy, they argued, could not weather another scandal involving a member of the royal family. The ghost of past controversies loomed large, reminding everyone of how quickly public opinion could turn against the crown. William had initially stood by her side, his jaw set with determination as he faced the growing storm. He had held her hand during emergency meetings with senior royals and palace officials. His voice had been steady when he addressed the first wave of criticism, defending his wife's character and dismissing the rumors as baseless gossip. They had weathered storms before, and he believed they could survive this one together. But as the days passed and the pressure intensified, something began to change. The constant meetings with advisors, the phone calls from his father expressing concern about the monarchy's reputation, and the mounting evidence that public support was eroding began to take their toll. William found himself caught between his love for Kate and his duty to the crown, a position that felt like being torn in half. The final blow came during a particularly difficult meeting with the Queen's private secretary and other senior officials. Charts and graphs were spread across the mahogany table, showing polling data and public sentiment analysis. The message was clear. Kate had become a liability that the monarchy could not afford. Suggestions were made about temporary separation, about Kate stepping back from royal duties, about creating distance to allow the storm to pass. Kate had watched William's face during that meeting, seeing the conflict play out in his eyes. She recognized the look of a man being forced to choose between the two things he loved most, his family legacy and his wife. The weight of generations of royal tradition pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible burden that grew heavier with each passing hour. Now, standing alone in the hallway, Kate read the letter that would change everything. The formal language could not disguise the crushing reality of its contents. She was being asked to temporarily step away from all royal duties, to avoid public appearances, and to consider whether her continued presence was in the best interest of the monarchy. The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if she simply disappeared from public life entirely. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family members who had seen the latest headlines. Her mother called repeatedly, her voice filled with worry and anger at the treatment her daughter was receiving. Kate's siblings offered their support, but she could hear the strain in their voices as they tried to navigate the media attention that had now engulfed their entire family. The children had been asking questions that Kate struggled to answer. Charlotte had come home from school in tears after classmates repeated things they had heard their parents discussing. George had grown quiet and withdrawn, sensing the tension that filled their home like a heavy fog. Louis, still too young to fully understand, simply wanted to know why Mommy seemed so sad all the time. Kate thought about her journey to this moment, remembering the young woman who had fallen in love with a prince at university. Back then, William had been just another student, charming and kind, with dreams that seemed achievable and a future that felt bright with possibility. She had known that loving him meant accepting a life in the public eye, but she had never imagined it would lead to this moment of complete devastation. The palace staff moved around her with careful efficiency, their eyes avoiding direct contact as they went about their duties. She could feel their sympathy, but also their uncertainty about how to treat someone whose position had become so precarious. The same people who had once bowed respectfully now seemed unsure of the proper protocol for addressing a duchess whose future remained in question. As evening approached, Kate found herself in the garden where she and William had shared so many quiet moments away from the public eye. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness that seemed at odds with the bitterness consuming her life. She remembered their wedding day, when this same garden had been filled with celebration and hope for the future. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her turn around. William approached slowly, his usually confident stride replaced by hesitant steps that spoke of his own inner turmoil. His face showed the strain of the past weeks, deep lines etched around his eyes that had not been there before. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that broke her heart all over again. He had come to tell her about the decision that had been made, about the recommendation from the senior royals that she step back from public life indefinitely. The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would somehow lessen their impact. He explained about duty and tradition, about the greater good and the need to protect the institution that had been entrusted to his care. Kate listened in silence, feeling each word land like a physical blow. When he finished speaking, the garden fell quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic beyond the palace walls. The world continued to move forward while her own world crumbled around her feet like sand slipping through her fingers. She looked at the man she had loved for so many years, seeing in his face the boy she had met at university and the future king he was destined to become. The conflict between those two identities had finally reached a breaking point, and she realized with crystal clarity that the institution would always win. The crown demanded sacrifices, and she was being asked to make the ultimate sacrifice of all. The letter in her hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, its formal language unable to disguise the fact that her life as she knew it was ending. Tomorrow, she would need to begin the process of stepping away from everything she had built, everything she had worked toward, everything that had given her purpose and meaning for the past decade. As darkness began to fall over the garden, Kate understood that this was more than just a temporary setback or another crisis to be managed. This was the beginning of the end of her fairy tale, the moment when the princess realized that sometimes love was not enough to overcome the forces that sought to tear it apart. The throne demanded everything, and those who stood too close risked being consumed by its relentless hunger for perfection and propriety. 3 months had passed since Kate stepped away from public life, and the silence had become her constant companion. The cottage in Norfolk, once a weekend retreat filled with laughter and family gatherings, now felt like a beautiful prison where she spent her days in exile. The media attention had not died down as promised. Instead, it had evolved into something more insidious, with photographers camping outside the property and drones attempting to capture images through the windows. William visited when he could, but their conversations had become strained and formal, like two diplomats negotiating a fragile peace treaty. He brought news from the outside world, updates about royal engagements and charitable events that she once would have attended beside him. Each visit reminded her of the life that had been stripped away, of the work she had been passionate about that now continued without her involvement. The children were struggling more than anyone wanted to admit. Charlotte had started having nightmares about photographers following her to school, while George had become aggressive with classmates who mentioned his mother's situation. Louis, still too young to understand the complexity of the situation, simply asked repeatedly when they could all go home together. Kate found herself making excuses and telling white lies to protect their innocence from a truth too harsh for young minds to process. Her private secretary, Emma, had remained loyal despite pressure from palace officials to distance herself from Kate's situation. Emma brought daily briefings about the ongoing media coverage and public opinion polls that showed a divided nation. Some people supported Kate and believed she was being treated unfairly, while others felt that the royal family had acted appropriately to protect the institution's reputation. The division was stark and showed no signs of healing. The charitable organizations that Kate had been patron of were struggling without her presence. Letters arrived daily from staff members and beneficiaries expressing their confusion and disappointment. The mental health initiative she had championed for years was losing momentum without its most visible advocate. Children's hospitals that had relied on her visits to boost morale and fundraising efforts were seeing donations decline. The ripple effects of her absence extended far beyond the palace walls. Kate spent hours walking through the countryside surrounding the cottage, finding solace in the natural beauty that remained unchanged by human drama. The rolling hills and ancient oak trees provided a sense of perspective that was impossible to find within the confines of royal life. During these walks, she began to rediscover parts of herself that had been subsumed by the role of Duchess, parts that remembered what it felt like to exist without the weight of constant scrutiny. Her relationship with her own family had become complicated in ways she had never anticipated. Her parents felt helpless watching their daughter's pain while being unable to intervene in royal affairs. Her siblings struggled with their own guilt, wondering if their association with Kate had somehow contributed to the scandal. Family gatherings became tense affairs where everyone tried to act normal while avoiding the elephant in the room that threatened to crush them all. The legal team handling Kate's interests had been working quietly to understand the implications of her situation. There were discussions about precedent and protocol, about what rights she retained and what obligations she still carried. The conversations were conducted in hushed tones and legal jargon that made her feel like she was being dissected rather than defended. Every option seemed to lead to further complications and additional sacrifices. Meanwhile, William was drowning in his own sea of responsibilities and guilt. His public appearances required him to maintain a facade of normalcy while privately dealing with the knowledge that his marriage was crumbling under pressure from the very institution he was sworn to serve. His private moments were filled with doubt about the decisions that had been made and the role he had played in allowing them to happen. The senior royals continued to monitor the situation closely, with regular meetings to assess whether enough time had passed for Kate to begin a gradual return to public life. However, each assessment concluded that the public remained too divided and the media too focused on the story for any immediate resolution. The suggestion began to emerge that a more permanent solution might be necessary, one that would allow the monarchy to move forward without the constant distraction of Kate's situation. Kate's days developed a routine that provided structure in the absence of purpose. Morning walks were followed by reading and correspondence with the few friends who remained in contact despite the circumstances. Afternoons were spent with the children when they visited, trying to create moments of normalcy and joy in their disrupted lives. Evenings were often the most difficult, when the cottage fell quiet and there was nothing to distract her from the reality of her isolation. The media speculation had evolved beyond the original scandal to encompass wild theories about Kate's mental health, her relationship with William, and the internal dynamics of the royal family. Television programs dedicated entire episodes to analyzing her situation, bringing in experts who claimed to have insider knowledge about the most private aspects of her life. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, becoming entertainment for a public hungry for royal drama. Support groups had formed online for people who believed Kate was being treated unfairly, while opposing groups argued that she had brought shame to the monarchy and deserved her punishment. The polarization was complete and seemed to be getting worse rather than better with time. Kate found herself at the center of a cultural battle about tradition, feminism, and the relevance of monarchy in the modern world. Her former lady-in-waiting, Sarah, visited one afternoon with news that shook Kate to her core. Sarah had learned through palace connections that discussions were underway about the possibility of an annulment or divorce that would allow William to remarry someone more suitable to the role of future queen. The conversation was presented as being in Kate's best interest, freeing her from the impossible burden of royal expectations and allowing her to rebuild her life outside the spotlight. That evening, Kate sat in the cottage's small library, surrounded by books that had once provided escape and comfort but now seemed like relics from a former life. The letter she had been dreading finally arrived, delivered by courier with the official royal seal. The contents were devastating in their formal politeness, outlining a path forward that would essentially erase her from royal history while providing her with financial security and limited access to their children. The proposal was presented as generous and forward-thinking, allowing both parties to pursue happiness while minimizing damage to the monarchy. Kate would retain her title but lose all official duties and public role. William would eventually be free to enter into a new marriage that would be more politically advantageous and less controversial. The children would remain in the line of succession, but would spend most of their time with their father, visiting Kate during scheduled periods that would not interfere with their royal education and duties. As she read the terms of what amounted to her complete exile from the life she had built, Kate felt something shift inside her. The grief and confusion that had dominated her thoughts for months began to transform into something harder and more determined. She realized that she had been passively accepting her fate, allowing others to make decisions about her future without fighting for what she believed was right. The cottage felt smaller that night as she paced through its rooms, her mind racing with possibilities she had not previously considered. For months, she had been the victim of circumstances beyond her control, but perhaps it was time to take back some agency in her own story. The letter had given her a deadline for response, but it had also given her something else: clarity about what she was truly fighting for. Outside, the Norfolk countryside lay peaceful under a canopy of stars that had witnessed countless human dramas throughout history. Kate stood at her window, looking out at the darkness and feeling something she had not experienced in months: the stirring of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since the scandal began, she felt ready to face them as something more than a victim waiting for salvation. The morning Kate received the ultimatum letter was the morning everything changed. Instead of crumbling as everyone expected, she felt a surge of determination that had been building quietly beneath months of despair. She called Emma and asked her to arrange a meeting with the most skilled media attorney in London, someone with no ties to the royal establishment who could provide independent advice about her options. The attorney, Margaret Chen, was a formidable woman who had built her reputation defending celebrities and politicians against media harassment. During their first meeting in a discreet office in Mayfair, Margaret listened carefully as Kate explained her situation without the filter of royal protocol or palace spin. For the first time in months, Kate was able to speak freely about what had really happened, about the innocent lunch that had been twisted into something scandalous, and about the machinery of destruction that had been unleashed against her. Margaret's assessment was both sobering and empowering. While Kate's position was indeed precarious, she had been suffering under a campaign of systematic harassment that might be legally actionable. More importantly, the palace's response had created a precedent that could potentially be challenged. If Kate was willing to fight publicly for her reputation and her rights, there were legal and strategic options that had never been explored. The decision to fight back was not made lightly. Kate understood that challenging the royal establishment would mean entering uncharted territory where the outcome was far from certain. But the alternative was accepting a future as a footnote in royal history, watching her children grow up believing their mother had been too weak or too guilty to defend herself. That prospect was more terrifying than any legal battle. Kate's first move was strategic and carefully planned. She reached out to James Mitchell, the childhood friend whose innocent lunch had sparked the entire controversy. James had been avoiding media attention, but when Kate explained her plan to set the record straight, he agreed to participate in a joint interview that would provide the truth about their relationship and the circumstances of their meeting. The interview was scheduled with a respected journalist known for fairness and thorough research. Rather than appearing defensive or apologetic, Kate and James spoke openly about their long friendship, their families' connections, and the support they had provided each other during difficult times in their lives. They provided text messages, emails, and testimony from mutual friends that demonstrated the purely platonic nature of their relationship. More significantly, Kate used the interview to address the broader issue of how the media had manufactured a scandal from nothing. She spoke eloquently about the impact of false reporting not just on her family, but on the charitable organizations that had suffered and the public who had been misled. Her words were measured but powerful, showing a woman who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger rather than broken. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted with support for Kate's courage in speaking out. The original photographers who had taken the pictures admitted under questioning that they had been commissioned to follow Kate specifically, raising questions about who had orchestrated the surveillance. Other media outlets began investigating the story behind the story, uncovering a web of palace intrigue and calculated character assassination. William's reaction to Kate's public defense was complex and revealed the depth of the pressure he had been under. During a private meeting at the cottage, he broke down and admitted that he had never believed Kate was guilty of anything beyond poor judgment in meeting an old friend. He had allowed himself to be convinced by advisors that the scandal was too big to fight, that the institution was more important than the truth. The conversation between Kate and William lasted through the night and into the dawn of a new day. Years of accumulated resentment, hurt, and misunderstanding poured out as they finally spoke honestly about the pressures that had driven them apart. William admitted that he had been a coward, choosing the easier path of sacrifice rather than the harder path of resistance. Kate acknowledged that she had expected him to be stronger than any person could reasonably be, carrying the weight of centuries of tradition while also being a supportive husband. Their reconciliation was not immediate or complete, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter built on honesty rather than the facades that had previously defined their relationship. William made the decision that should have been made months earlier. He would stand publicly with his wife and challenge anyone who questioned her character or her place in the royal family. The palace's response to Kate's interview was swift and predictable. Senior advisors called emergency meetings and drafted statements designed to minimize the impact of her revelations. However, the momentum had shifted dramatically. Public opinion polls showed a complete reversal in Kate's favor, with large majorities now viewing her as a victim of unfair treatment rather than a source of scandal. Kate's legal team, armed with evidence of coordinated harassment and possible criminal activity, began filing formal complaints against several media outlets. The photographers who had stalked her were charged with harassment and invasion of privacy. More significantly, investigation revealed that some of the most damaging stories had been based on information that could only have come from sources within the royal establishment itself. The children, who had suffered so much during the months of family crisis, began to show signs of healing as they watched their parents work together again. Charlotte started sleeping better after seeing her mother on television speaking confidently about the truth. George became less aggressive at school as the other children stopped repeating cruel rumors about his family. Louis simply enjoyed having both parents present and engaged during their time together. The charitable organizations that had suffered during Kate's absence reached out with enthusiastic invitations for her to resume her work. Mental health advocates, children's hospitals, and environmental groups had continued their missions but had missed her passionate advocacy and ability to bring attention to their causes. Kate's return to public service was met with celebrations and renewed energy from organizations that had feared losing their most effective patron. The broader implications of Kate's decision to fight back extended beyond her personal situation. Other members of the royal family, particularly the younger generation, began to question the traditional approach of silent suffering in the face of media attacks. A new model emerged that emphasized truth-telling and active defense rather than passive acceptance of whatever narrative emerged from tabloid culture. William's transformation throughout the crisis was perhaps the most significant change of all. The pressure that had once threatened to crush him had ultimately strengthened his resolve to protect what mattered most. He began speaking more forcefully about media responsibility and the human cost of manufactured scandals. His role as future king took on new dimensions as he demonstrated that leadership sometimes required standing against tradition rather than blindly following it. The marriage that had nearly been destroyed by external pressure emerged stronger and more authentic than it had ever been. Kate and William developed new ways of communicating about the pressures they faced and created systems for making decisions together rather than allowing outside forces to drive wedges between them. Their relationship became a partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to their family and their values. As Kate stood once again in the garden where she had felt so defeated months earlier, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of triumph. The roses were blooming again, their cycle of renewal mirroring her own transformation from victim to victor. The throne had demanded everything from her, but she had discovered that she was stronger than she had ever known, capable of fighting for her truth and winning against seemingly impossible odds. The story that had begun with Kate crumpling before the throne had become something entirely different, a tale of resilience, redemption, and the power of refusing to accept injustice. William had indeed sworn not to let her fall alone, but perhaps more importantly, Kate had learned that she was capable of standing on her own strength while still accepting the support of those who loved her. Their future together was no longer defined by the expectations and limitations imposed by others, but by their own choices and their commitment to building something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The crown would always be part of their lives, but it would no longer consume them. They had learned to serve the monarchy while still protecting their humanity, finding a balance that had eluded previous generations of royals who had sacrificed everything to an institution that demanded perfection from imperfect human beings.